Hello everyone. The story of Ron, the Black Dragon. Van Clief is one that feels larger than life. A story wrapped in mystery, pain, glory, and survival. For decades, the martial arts world revered him as a pioneer, a warrior, and a man whose strength seemed unbreakable. But what most people never knew was that behind the titles, the championships, and the fame was a truth that Ron had fought his entire life to keep buried, a secret that shaped him more than any battle ever could. This is not just a story about a fighter. It's a story about a man who refused to be broken, even when the world around him tried to crush his spirit. Long before he became the legendary Black Dragon, Ron Van Clief was a young boy growing up in Brooklyn, New York, during a time when racial tension was at its height and opportunities for young black men were few and far between. Life was not kind. Poverty, discrimination, and violence surrounded him at every turn. But even as a child, Ron was drawn to something deeper, something that promised him discipline and power, the ancient art of martial combat. He found his sanctuary in training, studying judo, karate, and kung fu with unmatched passion. But what truly defined him wasn't his physical strength. It was his ability to endure. By the time Ron reached his 20s, he was already earning a reputation on the streets as someone you didn't mess with. He joined the U.S. Marine Corps and served in Vietnam, where he faced horrors that would leave most men broken. But war didn't defeat Ron. It forged him. He came back home changed, not just mentally, but spiritually. He carried scars that weren't visible, memories that haunted him, and yet he also carried discipline, honor, and an unshakable will to rise above every obstacle. When he returned to New York, he threw himself into martial arts with renewed purpose. He began competing in tournaments across the country, earning titles and respect not just for his skill, but for his humility. His speed, precision, and power earned him the nickname the Black Dragon, a title that would become synonymous with his legend. But as his fame grew, so did the pressure, and the secret he had kept hidden for years threatened to destroy everything he had built. In the early 1970s, martial arts movies exploded in popularity, especially after the rise of Bruce Lee. Ron saw this as his chance to bring black excellence into a world that had largely excluded people who looked like him. He broke barriers by starring in his own martial arts films like The Black Dragon, The Way of the Black Dragon, and Black Dragon's Revenge, becoming one of the first African-American martial arts film stars. He choreographed his own fights, performed his own stunts, and refused to let Hollywood limit his potential. To the outside world, he was unstoppable, a real-life superhero. But deep inside, Ron was still fighting battles most people couldn't see. In interviews years later, he admitted that fame never healed the wounds left behind by the war, by racism, and by personal betrayal. Behind the Black Dragon persona was a man haunted by trauma, not just from his time in Vietnam, but from something much darker that happened before his fame began. For years, Ron Van Clief never spoke publicly about the racism and brutality he faced, even within the martial arts community. He endured beatings, slurs, and sabotage at tournaments where judges refused to score him fairly simply because he was black. He was arrested multiple times on false charges, targeted by police who saw a strong black man as a threat. One night, he was brutally beaten by officers in New York after leaving a tournament, left unconscious on the street, and that night changed him forever. He almost quit martial arts altogether, but rather than give up, Ron decided to rise higher. He said later, "They couldn't break me. They just made me sharper." He used that pain to fuel his training, turning every insult, every scar, into strength. But the secret he buried wasn't just about racial violence. It was about his personal pain, the abuse he suffered as a child, something he would not speak of publicly until much later in life. It was the root of his rage, his isolation, and his endless drive to prove himself. For decades, he channeled that buried trauma into his art, his teaching, and his movies. But it was always there, quietly shaping the man the world saw as invincible. As the years passed, Ron reinvented himself again and again. When he entered the UFC in 1994 at the age of 51, people laughed, calling him too old. But Ron didn't step into that cage to win. He wanted to stepped show in that to age, inspire. race, and pain could not define the human spirit. Though he didn't win his fight, his appearance that night became a defining moment in UFC history, a symbol of courage and defiance. Even his loss became a victory, because it reminded the world that legends aren't measured by wins, but by how they rise after defeat. But still, that hidden pain followed him. For years he fought depression and PTSD in silence. He once said in an interview, "I've fought hundreds of men in my life, but the hardest battle was the one in my mind." The truth he tried to bury finally began to surface in his later years. Ron started opening up about the struggles that had defined him. The racism, the trauma, the fear that he was never truly accepted in the world he helped create. He spoke about losing friends to violence and addiction, about the loneliness of being a pioneer, and the pain of seeing others take credit for what he had built. But he also found peace in teaching. As a grandmaster, he devoted his life to passing on wisdom, not just technique. He taught his students that martial arts wasn't about fighting others. It was about mastering yourself. The real dragon, he said, is the fear inside you. That one line summed up everything Ron Van Clief stood for. Even today, at over 80 years old, Ron continues to inspire fighters, veterans, and young dreamers. He's written books, directed documentaries, and traveled the world sharing his story. And though he tried for years to bury his pain, in the end, it became the very thing that made him immortal. His secret wasn't shame, it was survival. He survived poverty, racism, war, and personal demons, and somehow turned them all into purpose. The Black Dragon didn't just fight with his fists, he fought with his soul. His life stands as a living testament that even when the world forgets your name, your spirit can still roar loud enough to be remembered. So when people ask why Ron Van Clief kept so much hidden, the answer is simple. Some truths aren't meant to be buried forever. They're meant to bloom when the world is finally ready to understand them. And now, as we look back at his journey, we realize that the greatest secret Ron carried wasn't one of pain. It was one of strength. The world may have seen a fighter, but what they missed was the heart of a survivor, a philosopher, a teacher, and a man who taught us all that no matter how deep the wounds go, the warrior within can always rise again. Thanks for watching.